up, everyone? I hope you're all having a wonderful day. As promised, this is part 1 of the Resident Evil reviews for the PlayStation 4. Starting off with the Origins collection, we're gonna take a look at Resident Evil HD Remaster, the remaster of the remake of the original game. Well, that's a mouthful. You might have noticed that this video was uploaded on the 22nd of March, which coincides with the 25th anniversary of one of the longest running, most important, and most influential franchises ever made. As always, if you enjoy this type of content and would love to see more, or maybe you just want to show some support, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe. Let's begin. Part 1. The premise. It is July of 1998 and grisly murders were suddenly on the rise in the once peaceful little town of Raccoon City. The Raccoon local police department had a very strange case on their hands. Victims were not just being murdered, they were being eaten alive. This case was then handed over to their Elite Special Forces Division, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, also known as STARS. One of the investigating team's Bravo team went missing somewhere in the forest, and therefore Alpha Team had to step in and figure out what's going on here. Picking up where Bravo Team's trail left off, Alpha Team soon discovers their comrade's helicopter crashed and in abysmal condition, along with the pilot Kevin, his eyes gouged out and his face slashed to pieces. It became apparent there and then that Alpha Team was not alone in these woods. One of the STARS members, Joseph Frost, soon ended up meeting a similar fate just moments after discovering Kevin's corpse. This is where we get introduced to one of the two protagonists, Jill Valentine. Upon hearing the cries of agony, Jill turns around and witnesses the first of many instances where this particular night will scar her for life. Her friend and colleague Joseph was mauled to death before her very own eyes. Petrified and unbelievably disturbed, she opens fire. As skilled as Jill may be, she was not ready for this situation. Her colleague's death left a serious mental scar on her. She practically unloaded the entire magazine at these disobedient canines and couldn't hit a target to save her life. Pun intended. What follows next is one of my most favorite scenes in the franchise and probably the best scene in the entire game. One of the dogs starts running towards Jill, but before he could give her a big hug, we get a glimpse of our second main protagonist, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Chris Redfield. Right off the bat, we are immediately shown that Chris has devastating accuracy with a handgun when he shoots at the dog flying in midair. Poor doggo, he probably just wanted a hug or a belly rub. Why did they have to put him Oh. So after having witnessed Chris forever ruining that dog's chance at winning the next Raccoon City dog pageant, the camera then cuts to my favorite close-up in the entire remake. This right here is one of the rarest moments in the franchise where we get to see a glimpse of masterful storytelling being conveyed only through facial expressions. Not a single word was uttered here, just a simple close-up of Jill, covered in blood, traumatized. Even though Chris had just saved her, her eyes looked dead, frozen in the middle of a fight-or-flight situation. But Jill being one tough cookie, she snaps out of it and the two of them run for their lives. A bright spotlight hovers over them, fading away in the distance. Their fellow STARS colleague and helicopter pilot Brad was popular for being scared easily, and probably took off without telling anyone, leaving the STARS members no other choice than to seek refuge in a weird-looking mansion lying far off in the distance. Could this have been a safe haven? We'll find that out soon enough.
There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Jill, and myself. We don't know where Barry is.
Part 2. The Spencer Mansion. No matter who you pick at the start, what happens next will be fairly similar. In both cases, you will always have 3 remaining STARS members who end up making it inside the mansion. If you picked Jill at the start, she will be accompanied by Barry Burton and Albert Wesker. If you picked Chris, however, he will be accompanied by Jill Valentine and Wesker himself. Barry is nowhere to be found. There is one important character, however, that will be present no matter who you choose. Arguably the most important character of the whole game. This character is not a human being. It is none other than the mansion itself. The mansion in this remake is the most pivotal aspect of the whole game, and truly in a sense, a character of its own. The Spencer Mansion is iconic and hauntingly beautiful. So far we've only seen the main hall, but you can already tell from first glance that this place looks spectacular. Just look at how breathtaking and detailed this place is, and that is just one location. This level of detail remains consistent in almost every corner of this house, from top to bottom. Whether it's the east wing, the west wing, squeaky clean dining rooms, claustrophobic corridors, bedrooms, wandering through the chilly night fog as you listen to the dogs, or whatever freak show is wandering around the forest outside, every inch of this game is excellently crafted. Something else that elevates the overall presentation here even further is the fixed camera angles. Now, before I go any further into discussing one of the most divisive topics in the whole Resident Evil community, I should tell you where I'm coming from in all this. I started with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, not Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And I know this might surprise a lot of people when I say this, but I think that fixed camera angles were not that great. Not saying they're bad, not at all, but I do think they're a tad bit overrated. It is interesting to see so many people blinded by nostalgia. Fixed camera angles were not dropped without a reason. While they're very unique and interesting, they're not perfect, and I'll get to that in a bit. A lot of people like to oversell this point of view of fixed camera angles as the one true way to make Resident Evil a survival horror game. But if we're being honest, that argument is pure bullcrap. Now, one could say that there is an argument to be made about fixed camera angles and tank controls making a game much scarier, but it is much deeper than that. The fixed camera angles and tank controls is not the reason that that's happening here. I cannot stress this enough. The idea that fixed camera angles make Resident Evil scary is like saying that Dark Souls 2 is the most challenging one simply because of the intentionally placed pain-in-the-ass enemies. That is not difficult or scary to me. That is just cheap, plain and simple. With this being said, am I saying that Dark Souls 2 or the classic fixed camera angles Resident Evil games are bad? Are you kidding me? Not at all. While it is true to some extent that reviews are just opinions after all, there still needs to be some level of objectivity to be taken into consideration here, which is exactly why for Resident Evil Remake, I'm making an exception. Resident Evil Remake is an amazing game because of its fixed camera angles, not in spite of them. Let me explain why. There is a reason that Resident Evil got remade in 2002, just 6 years later. There's also a reason why it's a lot better than the original. The remake released around a very interesting time. The technological leap from the 5th to the 6th generation of consoles was so monumental to the point that pre-rendered backgrounds were finally starting to look photorealistic. Pre-rendered backgrounds are not as graphically intensive as fully 3D environments. Factoring this into the equation meant that the developers had a chance to take advantage of the GameCube's capabilities in other areas, such as creating more realistic character models, better audio, better textures, better atmosphere, better lighting. The point I'm trying to make here is that Resident Evil's graphics had improved enough for fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds to finally look like they were shots from a horror movie. The constant juxtaposition between the realistic backdrops and the impressive character models and animations, mixed with the clever use of lighting and shot composition, meant that every single one of these components combined into something that is absolutely magnificent, a technical marvel stronger than the sum of its parts. What Shinji Mikami and his team over at Capcom managed to achieve with this game is nothing short of incredible. There is no doubt in my mind that Resident Evil Remake did the fixed camera angles the best. So those were some of my thoughts about the game's setting and its overall presentation, but now it's time to talk about the HD Remaster and the changes it brought to the table. Well, for starters, as the name implies, it is now upscaled to high definition. This remaster comes with some other improvements, however. The remaster now offers a 16:9 widescreen option and a control scheme alternative to the tank controls. Other changes include sharper textures, improved anti-aliasing, and a better frame rate. The overall lighting has also been given a major overhaul. The fixed camera angles have also been tweaked a little bit. Whenever your character moves on screen, the camera now pans vertically and horizontally, depending on where you're going, giving the game a slightly more cinematic look as you carefully tread through the dark corridors to the sound of dead silence and the occasional roaring thunders. Overall, the remaster manages to preserve a lot of the original characteristics, while also adding a whole lot of new ones. I do have some small gripes, however. Two of them. Number 1. Unlike tank controls, the alternate control scheme feels like it has no weight to the character movements, and it can break the immersion sometimes. especially when you're trying to dodge the zombies, or whenever the camera angle changes drastically and you have to readjust accordingly. One other thing to note here is that while the remaster does offer some impressive quality of life improvements, it can sometimes feel like the essence of its presentation has been tampered with. The overall aesthetic can feel too clean and colorful compared to the GameCube version. It lacks that green filter that it used to have, which can sometimes feel like a slight tonal shift, but these two issues aren't really that big of a deal, to be honest. The overall experience is still mostly intact. Part 3. Gameplay and Horror Elements. RE Remake is the penultimate game in the franchise to have ever used the fixed camera angles and the pre-rendered backdrops. As with every other Resident Evil game from its time, the gameplay loop consisted of running around a maze-like structure, solving a plethora of puzzles tied to the story progression. And as you do all of this, you are confronted with this constant dilemma to save your ammunition, precious herbs, and anything else that comes along the way in order to stay alive. It is this weird, never-ending cycle of talking to yourself and wondering, what the fuck do I take with me? Do I take the handgun bullets? Do I take the key? But no, I need those 2 item slots. What if I come across something? What if I just, oh fuck this, give me that shotgun. The gameplay department is where the fixed camera angles come across as a double-edged sword. As I already mentioned, this type of camera perspective is exceptional at elevating the atmosphere. Cleverly placed enemies or items of interest can absolutely scare the living shit out of you the first couple of times, but this is where it all starts to fall apart. By far the biggest problem of this game is not the pre-rendered backgrounds themselves, but rather what had to be sacrificed for all of this to work. On top of the pre-rendered backgrounds, the game doubles down on that sense of realism by adding slower animations than prior games. That is the one true problem that I have with what is otherwise an almost perfect survival horror experience. This game has a serious problem with its tank controls and the modern control scheme. The modern control scheme is actually far worse, and I'll get to that in a bit. The tank controls, unfortunately, did not stand the test of time. They've aged pretty poorly, but for back in the day, they were kind of good. It is important to note that the biggest advantage to tank controls is they give a lot of weight to character movement. Another huge advantage that is so difficult not to point out is that whenever you press up on the thumbstick, the character will keep walking or running forward irrespective of the camera change. In the most literal sense for me, this is a game changer. I just cannot stand when I play these type of games with a 2D control scheme. I couldn't even get through Silent Hill without tank controls. I mean, I can, but why would I torture myself like that? I'm no masochist. Of course, the drawback with the tank controls, as I already said, is the slow animations and it makes it harder to dodge. Let's just put it that way. It is entirely possible to dodge with tank controls, but I just don't bother with that. It's already a slow game, and I really get tired of baiting zombies the slow way in this game. Come on, man, I'm not getting any younger here. I have a reservation at— oh, no, wait, I feel something. And now I'm dead of old age and boredom. Thanks. Moving on to the modern and alternative control scheme, while this does fix some of the problems of the tank controls, it also just creates a whole new set of problems. Let's start with the good things first. It makes dodging a lot easier. The problem with this? It makes dodging a lot easier. Here's another good thing. It makes movement extremely fast. The problem with this? It makes movement extremely fast. This is obviously a recurring theme in this layout. Every single advantage or fix that they've applied here does not come without some kind of detriment. There's also other problems that are completely opposite to the tank controls. I'll get the biggest problem out of the way first. Because the alternate control scheme is so sensitive in comparison to the tank controls, the slightest movements from the thumbstick, whenever the camera angle changes, the characters will lose their shit and start running the other direction. Adding the problem of stick drift into the mix, and you got yourself one hell of a recipe for disaster, especially if you're planning on doing speedruns or attempting the harder difficulties. And if you're gonna go for the platinum trophy like I did, that's gonna be a problem. It is not impossible, but the controls are just gonna make what is already a fairly challenging trophy much worse than it needs to be. It is a fun platinum, don't get me wrong, but I just thought you should know. And I'm not saying this to discourage you at all, actually I hope not. There is a solution to the controls. It's not perfect by any means, but it is much better. But before I get to that, let me just get the last drawback out of my system. It is no secret that Resident Evil Remake is deliberately slow-paced. even down to its animations. Now keep in mind that I do not like this about this game, for gameplay reasons, not artistic ones, because artistically speaking, this is an amazing choice. It helps to sell this illusion of it being a grounded experience, which is exactly why I have a problem with the modern control scheme. The fluidity of its movement sticks out like a sore thumb. It just feels like it was quickly phoned in to attract a modern audience and didn't actually put much thought into it. Maybe it's because the remake didn't sell very well at launch, so maybe Capcom thought that shoehorning this control scheme would save them time and money. But I'm gonna have to press X to doubt on that one, Chief. Remake did not sell very well, but it was not because of the game itself, it was because of the GameCube exclusivity. It was no secret that Resident Evil Remake was a critically acclaimed video game. It's not like Capcom couldn't see this coming. When they ported Resident Evil 4 from the GameCube to other consoles, it started to sell like hotcakes. And this was going to be inevitable for the remake as well. Everyone and their mother knew this was gonna sell well if it got ported to other consoles, but apparently they didn't get the memo. It's just so fucking hilarious when a game studio has a literal gold mine sitting under their noses for over a decade, and yet when it gets released, they are shocked to see it do so well and just go full surprise Pikachu. But that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is both control layouts have a serious problem of going too far in opposite directions, and I just wish there was a system that was somewhere in the middle. My idea of the perfect controls for this game would still be tank controls, but I wish the animation speed was a bit more sped along the lines of the highly underrated Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and that's actually something I wanted to point out. Resident Evil 3 has, in my opinion, the most pleasant tank controls, like it's not even in the same league. I understand why the controls were reverted back to the slower movements. It helps with the groundedness, and Remake is a slow burn after all. I just personally wish there was a middle ground, but that's never gonna happen unless we see yet another full-blown remake of this game. So let's jump straight into the solution I was talking about earlier. I usually set the control layout to Type E. The cool thing about Type E is that pressing the R2 button always moves the character forward, and it's also pressure sensitive. A gentle press is for walking, and a full press is for running. I use this because it makes turning left and right with the thumbstick or the D-pad much easier, and if you let go of the R2 and start moving the left thumbstick, the movement immediately switches to alternate controls. It lets you switch back and forth on the control schemes, both of them, on the fly. It gives you the best of both worlds, and I highly recommend it. Easily my go-to setup. So that wraps up what I don't like about its gameplay, why I didn't like certain elements, while also offering a solution that enhanced my experience playing it, and hopefully yours as well. But now let's talk about what I do like about the gameplay. There's actually a lot that I like here. I'm gonna start off with what is, without a doubt, one of the best gameplay mechanics that actually originated from RE Remake. The defensive items. Defensive items are self-explanatory. They are items you can use to defend yourself when things get too close for comfort. You can use a defensive item when you get grabbed by an enemy. Not only do you avoid taking any damage, but you actually end up damaging them instead. Now obviously, being a defensive item, not offensive, you cannot use this in combat. This is just to get you out of a sticky situation. But the passiveness of such items gives the gameplay a whole new layer to it. Ammo is scarce enough as it is, and combat can have some ramifications if you are not being strategic about what to shoot and when. So a defensive item is actually a great safety net for those who aren't yet used to the idea of running past enemies instead of confronting them, which you will absolutely have to get on board with to make it through this game, especially on the harder difficulties. Just like any other ammo, these defensive items aren't that plentiful, so be sure to plan your routes carefully and save them for when you desperately need them in a pinch. The second thing I love about Remake that sadly never made a return ever since is, bar none, the most terrifying zombie of any Resident Evil game, the Crimson Heads. A Crimson Head is basically a zombie that revives itself through something called the V-Act process. There's actually multiple strains of this process with different mutations, but the one in the Spencer Mansion turns its undead residents into these raging red wolverines with freakishly long claws and fried vocal cords that are just straight up nightmare fuel. This is how you make a scary fucking zombie. Since Crimson Heads only become that way if you shoot a normal zombie, this means you're gonna think twice before you unload a whole magazine on Joey and Stevie down the hallway over there. Because of this new gameplay mechanic, the slow shambling zombies also become a real threat. Combining the fear of spawning Crimson Heads with defensive items means that even the simplest of enemies require you to strategize and to learn to mind your surroundings. It definitely amplifies the fear factor, making even the dullest moments feel tense and slightly more interesting. Third thing I love about Resident Evil Remake is the puzzles. I just love how this mansion was intentionally built in such a weird way, full of secrets and weird contraptions. The puzzles are clever clever, imaginative, some of them can even be a head-scratcher, but not exactly what I'd call frustrating. The backtracking for some of these puzzles can be annoying for a new player if you're not being very careful, but solving a lot of these puzzles can be very satisfying. I know this is just my opinion, but Remake probably has some of the best puzzles of any Resident Evil game. One last thing before I wrap up the gameplay section, I also love the old school combat. It's old school, very simplistic, and doesn't require much accuracy. You just have to press aim and shoot. But sometimes nothing beats the simplicity of just aiming your shotgun towards the ceiling and just blowing a zombie's head clean off. The game offers two playable characters with different scenarios and different skill sets, but who should you play as first? And my pick would be Jill Valentine. And I'm gonna explain why. Jill has some interesting advantages over Chris. Well, first of all, she can carry more items. That's it. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. She has a lockpick, she can solve the piano puzzle all alone, she has access to more powerful weapons like the grenade launcher, and she also has Barry Burton by her side. Seriously guys, it's absolutely ridiculous how many advantages she's got. Poor Chris cannot catch a break. Chris Redfield is basically the bad luck Brian of this game, or of any Resident Evil game for that matter, but that's a topic for another day. So what's different about Chris's playthrough? Well, here we go. As opposed to Jill's 8 inventory slots, he's only got 6. Tough shit. There are some doors in this house that Jill could instantly unlock with her lockpick. But unfortunately, Chris does not have this luxury. He has to run around looking for antique keys, and each key can only open a single door. It's not exactly the end of the world, but it does make exploration feel slightly more tedious. He also doesn't get a grenade launcher, and if you take the shotgun without replacing it with the broken shotgun, there's no Barry to save you. You're on your own. Well, that is until you find another STARS member called Rebecca, who Chris will have to depend on from time to time in order to progress. Another useful thing about Rebecca is if Chris finds her in a safe room, she can treat his wounds. I wouldn't blame you if by now you're getting the sense that Chris is an absolute moron, but it's not exactly true. Let's get into why. Chris actually has more to him than meets the eye. Despite the awful hand he gets dealt, he can definitely hold his own. The most obvious advantage to Chris is his HP. Unlike Jill, he can withstand a crap ton of damage. Chris is also better with a firearm, and he has a higher chance of landing a critical headshot. Instead of a lockpick, he carries a lighter that doesn't take inventory space, which can come in handy for burning corpses and lighting up dark rooms. And last but not least, Chris has the most badass defense item, a hand grenade. Just shove one of these bad boys in that zombie's pie hole and tell him to shut the fuck up. Part 4. The Sound. Earlier on in this video, I explained that fixed camera angles in a Resident Evil game are not what makes it a survival horror game. There's a lot more to it. There is something in survival horror games that is far more important than any fixed camera angle could ever be, and that is the sound. Sound in video games is actually a very interesting process, consisting of both diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. I've noticed a very specific similarity between sound design in video games and movie editing. So this is a weird one. In movie editing, everything is supposed to flow organically, like there's nothing supposed to stick out like a sore thumb. The subtlety is intentional, allowing for viewers to be enriched by the experience of the editing rather than actually focusing on it. Now, looking back at the video games and its sound, it's not exactly the same, but there is one tiny little aspect to it that is very similar. Video game music, for example, does not need to be subtle, neither do the sound effects. So what exactly is it about sound that needs to be subtle? Well, let me explain. When you're watching a movie or a video game, you're not just watching a movie or a video game, you're also listening to it. If you're looking at something without visuals, well, you can't see shit. But when you're looking at something without sound, you only get half the picture. You know the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words? Well, in movies and video games, a picture without sound isn't worth shit. It's not always the case, but when it comes to video games and movies, given that they're moving pictures, you can't have one without the other. For the most part, that is. And that's where the subtlety comes in. Any given sound, diegetic or non-diegetic, has to fit with what the picture's trying to convey. And this to me is what's so interesting about the sound of Resident Evil and the survival horror genre in general. Within a game's world, you're gonna hear sounds that are not supposed to be there, but as someone who's playing the video game and experiencing it from an outside point of view, from outside the world, it's gonna make sense to you, it's not gonna feel jarring. It is no coincidence that some of the best and most successful survival horror games ever released are all some of the best sounding games ever made, and they're also the scariest and most disturbing ones as well. These are games like Bloodborne, Dead Space, Bioshock, Amnesia, Little Nightmares, PT, The Last of Us, Silent Hill, and Resident Evil. Coincidence? Not at all. What I'm about to say applies for all Resident Evil games, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to use examples just from Resident Evil Remake. Would fixed camera angles still be scary without the sound to elevate them? Would the abrupt lightning strikes be unsettling if it wasn't for the sound roaring malevolently just outside the strangely peaceful corridors? Would the silence of these corridors creep you out if there wasn't the sound of footsteps and creaking floorboards to contrast with that silence? Would the Crimson Heads make you lose a week of sleep if they didn't sound like a sleep paralysis demon that brushes its teeth with a wood chipper and gargles with sandpaper? There's only two valid answers for this question. A, your name's Ichabod Crane and your own shadow startles you in broad daylight, or B, no. I'm splitting this part into two sections, diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. The easiest way I can describe diegetic and non-diegetic sounds is that diegetic sounds are sounds that come from inside of the game's world, and non-diegetic are sounds that come externally that help accompany the game's world. For the diegetic sounds, we'll be taking a look at sound effects and character dialogue. I've already touched upon some sound effects, but now I'm gonna go in more detail. One particular sound effect that gets a lot of work done in horror games is footsteps. And for the most part, they're done excellently here. Worn and torn floorboards creak under the heavy boots of either STARS member. Blades of grass brush gently with every careful step as you occasionally step outside for fresh air, only to end up inhaling the rancid stench of zombie-itis instead. And speaking of zombies, most of them shamble around the house, sounding as if they just discovered death metal for the first time and said, fuck it, I wanna be the lyrics to a Cannibal Corpse song. They basically sound like broken bones and wet sponges. It's gruesome, but in an awesome way. My only nitpick would be is that I wish Jill and Chris didn't use the exact same footsteps. They're different people with very different physicalities, but that's all it really is at the end of the day, a nitpick. Next up, we got weapon sounds. If there's one thing I enjoy on a consistent level about Resident Evil sound effects, it's the gunshots. Whether it's the satisfying pop of a 9mm barely making a dent through the rotting flesh of the undead, or maybe you decide you just wanna repaint the house red with whoever happens to be on the wrong end of your shotgun barrel. The synchronized sound of the gunshots and the tearing of rotten flesh, pairing that with the dead silence in most parts of the mansion, provides feedback that feels so good that the gunshots sound powerful even when they don't do jack shit. And I love it. Other sound effects like the cackling of cozy fireplaces, grandfather clocks ticking in the middle of a dreadful night, crickets chirping in the trees and the bushes outside, or even just wading through flooded rooms, then dropping electrical equipment within these flooded rooms to turn menacing creatures into harmless little kebabs, etc, etc. It's just excellent through and through. And that's it for the sound effects. On to the dialogue. I'm just gonna state the obvious and get it over with. The difference in voice acting from the original to the remake is unbelievably drastic. It's night and day. But it's not perfect. Make no mistake, the original's dialogue has since gone down in history, cementing itself into the legendary status of "it's so bad it's good." It was basically Tommy Wiseau's The Room, the video game. So obviously in comparison, the 1996 version is gonna make the remake sound like it's got the writing chops of a Quentin Tarantino movie. But that's not exactly difficult, considering the quality of the dialogue had pretty much nowhere else to go but up. Back when the remake came out, people loved the improvements done to the dialogue, but was it really that great? Well, the answer is yes and no. I think that for its time, it was great. Back then, voice acting and writing in video games simply wasn't held to the high standards of today. I think that both returning players and newcomers alike were happy with what they got, no doubt about it. But given that this is a review for the current gen systems more than it is for the GameCube remake itself, I want to shed some light on how it holds up to modern standards. Unfortunately, some of the dialogue simply hasn't aged very well. As per usual with the Resident Evil series, the writing just isn't that great, but I genuinely feel that the voice actors did their best with what little they had to work with. It's not much, but it's serviceable. However, I would have liked a bit more character development here. The dynamics between some characters just leaves a lot to be desired. Characters have a habit of showing up where it's convenient, and at times they show up in places that make no sense. I'm also kind of bummed that some characters from one campaign don't show up in the other. It just feels so undercooked and disjointed all the way to the end, and because of this, a lot of the emotions within the voice acting just didn't resonate with me at all. Most of the lines are just not as memorable. Even with that said, I did enjoy the chemistry between some of the characters. I like Chris and Jill as a duo, but the one that stands out to me the most is Chris and Rebecca. I like how they bonded as time went on. Unfortunately, I just cannot say the same for Jill and Barry. Much like the rest of the cast, most of their voice acting is pretty spot on, especially Barry. It's pretty weird that I think that Barry has some of the best voice acting in this game, Talk about a complete U-turn. They kept some of his iconic lines, but they've been nerfed so much that they're just forgettable. The reality is that better voice acting just isn't gonna cut it. You need better writing as well. Your cast is only as good as your writing, and nothing shows that like the dynamic between Jill and Barry. I enjoyed them as two separate characters, but I just couldn't buy into the relationship they had. It wasn't convincing in the slightest. I know that this is Resident Evil and it's all about cheesy dialogue that's not supposed to be taken very seriously, but unlike a lot of the other installments, the remake is a game that goes so much out of its way to establish such a dark and mature tone that I just wish it had done something more. That covers all I wanted to say about the diegetic sounds. Now I want to talk briefly about the non-diegetic sound, or in other words, the music. The background music used in Resident Evil Remake, much like every other facet of sound in this game, is top-notch. Something that's really special about old-school video games is how well they're capable of balancing great music with no moments of music at all. This negative space between music tracks can be used in different ways, but one thing that I find it always did best was provide excellent contrasting effect with the music track that follows right after. The emotions evoked right after this get amplified because the silence has deprived you of that excitement, and when the music starts up again, the rush comes back even stronger. I'll give you two examples as to how Resident Evil likes to do this. First example, let's say you're within a familiar location, but this location is so complex and hard to memorize that it takes you a while to figure out where to go next. So let's say it takes 10 to 15 minutes of puzzle solving to open up a new path. Those 15 minutes you are used to hearing a track that evokes a sense of mystery with a hint of sinister going on underneath. So now you've opened the door and you don't know where this thing leads and the music just stops. You're suddenly deprived of that sense of familiarity. Now it's completely changed. It's that fear of the unknown. You walk slowly around the room with your butt clenched, bracing whatever cheap jump scare these fixed camera angles can throw at you, but sometimes nothing happens. The change from music to no music has accomplished its goal to make you scared of your own shadow. Nothing's there. But then you go to another room, and surprise, something's jumped out of that window. You've been robbed from the sense of security that you've been trying to get a hold of all this time. But now that you've let your guard down, the game just goes from, haha, I'm just messing with you to, oops, guess I was not. This negative space is not just used to scare you though, it's also used to make you feel relieved. Which brings us to example number 2. Let's take that same location again. You've solved the puzzle, you've opened a new path, the music stops. Once again you proceed with caution, your mind is restless, thinking of all the possible ways this game will try to scare you, and instead, you're greeted with the tranquil music, supplies, and a typewriter. Nothing's gonna hurt you. You don't know for how long, but right now, you're safe. You can relax. The importance of silence, especially for the horror genre, just cannot be understated. Sometimes less is more, and Resident Evil Remake understands this perfectly. But obviously for this to work, silence has to be complemented by good music, and Resident Evil Remake has some stellar music. Ambient tracks that are equally oppressive as they are comforting accompany you for a large chunk of the game as you solve puzzles and unlock new doors, and certain boss battles come packing with these fast-paced melodies that sort of perfectly capture the increase in heart rate of both you and your character as the game challenges your motor functions, item management, and weapon strategy. It's not perfect. Some of the ambient tracks can get old if you get stuck too often or end up having to backtrack, but luckily it's often well balanced, and like I said, sometimes you have parts where the game just pipes down on the music and lets the ambient sound effects do their job. Overall, it's excellent. And now we begin to wrap this up. Part 5. Conclusion. Resident Evil Remake was an incredible milestone. Not only did it improve upon RE96 in almost every single way imaginable, but it also cemented itself as what one could argue to be the best video game remake of all time. Considering we're now living in an age where games are being remade, remastered, re-remade, re-remastered, re-repackaged, whatever you want to call it, that's quite the highest compliment that I could give it. But also, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Listen, people can argue about how the clunkiest camera system ever witnessed in horror games is secretly the best thing since sliced bread all they want, and complain about how over-the-shoulder ruined Resident Evil, but the reality of it is that the director that changed this franchise to over-the-shoulder is the same director of Resident Evil Remake, not to mention Resident Evil 1996 itself, and he literally started this franchise. To say that Resident Evil Remake is perfection, and the minute the creator goes a different direction you don't like, you start claiming that the other game is not a true survival horror game just because you're stuck in memory memory lane, you're basically saying that you think you know and understand the franchise better than the creator himself. And that simply isn't possible. That's just hubris. It's pretentious and it doesn't move the conversation forward. We can argue all day about what makes a video game survival horror, but the answer just doesn't lie with us. It lies with the developers. Developers have made it crystal clear time and time again that fixed camera angles were simply a product of their time. Correlation is not causation. Hell, even just the fact that the director wanted to change things up already means that things were not perfect in the first place. If it was so perfect, then why would it need to change? If it ain't broken, don't fix it. Not to mention, there's not many developers out there trying to take advantage of fixed camera angles these days, except for maybe the creators of the medium, but even that doesn't push the medium forward. I said medium. But all jokes aside, the point I'm trying to make is that maybe fixed camera angles just are not as innovative as people like to make them out to be. Keyword being maybe. I'm sure there's some ways developers can push the medium forward, but as of now, I just haven't seen anything, which is kind of unfortunate to be honest. I'm not the biggest fan of fixed camera angles, but I can see the potential. Will we see that potential in the foreseeable future be explored further? I wouldn't write it off just yet, however, I would not hold my breath either, but things can change. Capcom might be looking at the medium right now and seeing that it's making a financial success, and maybe they're interested in implementing fixed camera angles once again, maybe in a spin-off game. But until then, Resident Evil Remake will still be the best example of fixed camera angles that we've got so far. And with all things considered, Resident Evil Remake has actually aged very well. It hasn't aged as well as some other games in this series, but considering that this is a fixed camera angles game and it has aged as well as it did, I think it speaks high volumes about its quality. Resident Evil Remake is just a masterpiece. It is deeply flawed, rough around the edges, but a masterpiece nonetheless. Should you buy this for current gen systems? Absolutely. I did state some flaws about it, but that's just an inevitable thing every video game goes through by time, masterpiece or not. The flaws I've stated are not there to discourage you, but they're just there to make you know what you're in for before going into it. And what you're getting into is one of the greatest horror games you can play, even to this day. Now, if I had to give this game a score, I don't believe numbers have anything to do with whether or not you should buy it, but I would rate my personal experience somewhere about an 8 out of 10. It is a masterpiece, but a masterpiece does not have to be perfect. By definition, a masterpiece simply means a work of outstanding artistry, skill, or workmanship, and Resident Evil Remake is the epitome of just that. And with that, the Rayven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.